In our study of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, we are in the midst of the chapter describing that which is life of our life, the force which drives our life force. And so in this chapter, Sri Aurobindo begins by summarizing all the activities of the life energy in our being, what role it plays, the various functions, the extent to which our mind and our physical body are dependent on this life force. And only later he goes to the question of what is it that drives this life force. But in this initial discussion, there is a sweeping description of all that the life force does in us, which is of a critical importance in the practice of the yoga, at least in its preliminary stages. In the portion we have already read, Sri Aurobindo discusses life energy as something which is non-material, but which is the cause of all material forms and material processes. And the means by which we can become aware of this in us is not by material process, therefore, but by our own psychological subtilization of our sensations and knowledge through yoga. In a sense, the only laboratory in the universe by which you can directly detect prana in its essence is ourselves. All material physical laboratory and laboratory processes can only stop with physical analysis, which will resolve to combinations of material happenings. It is only a laboratory which is itself using means which are non-physical and of an awareness which is subtler than the life force. In such a laboratory can you become aware of life force and detect it directly, and that is us. So we are the laboratory, and we become capable by this subtilization of our sensation and knowledge. We become capable of analysis other than resolution of forms into their gross elements. We are able to distinguish operations of pure mind from the physical consciousness, and both of these separate from the vital or dynamic which forms a link between them and supports both. As a result, when we are conscious of the life energy in us, he says, we are able to distinguish the movements of the pranic currents not only in the physical body but also in the subtle. So this life energy is flowing. Let's draw a picture. A gross body below, the subtle body above. The life force animates both and mediates between the two. Now this picture will be useful because later, probably next week, we will see how the life energy working through these two is the driving energy. And in a sense, it reaches through them and pulls both of these materials, mind and body, forward. Very similar to the image of the horse, which pulls the chariot. As it pulls the chariot is behind, lagging, being dragged by the horse. But also the mind which is seated in the chariot is led by the horse. So both the mental consciousness and the physical consciousness, the mind body and the gross physical body, are dependent on this life energy which pulls them forward. It engages with both and mediates between, links the two. And this is the reason he will explain why the text of the Kena speaks of the life energy as the word is yoked. Yoked, the life breath moves forward on its paths, and the yoking is by the mind and the body onto life force, which is now animating and driving both. Now, by this process now of becoming conscious within us, he says, we become aware of the subtle body and the life energy in the subtle body, using means such as pranayam, governance and control of the respiration. The Hatha Yogin is able to control, suspend and transcend the ordinary fixed operations of pranic energy, which are needed for the normal functioning of the body. And this is a very important, though summary description, it's a very important description of the relationship of prana and the gross body. And then he discusses becoming aware of the channels in which the energy distributes itself in the gross body and in the subtle body. And all of these being governed by the prana, it is possible then to exceed the limitations of the gross body and even the subtle body and do things which normally would appear to us as miraculous, because we are able to activate the life force directly by passing the normal narrow channels of its operation. Now, all of this is what we had read last time, and I had promised to move to a different text which elaborates on these. But just before we move to that, the next paragraph discusses the operation of the life force in the mind. And so we will briefly read this. But the pranic energy supports not only the operations of our physical life, but also those of the mind in the living body. Therefore, by the control of the pranic energy, it is not only possible to control our physical and vital functionings and to transcend their ordinary operation, but to control also the workings of the mind and to transcend its ordinary operations. The human mind, in fact, depends always on the pranic force, which links it with the body, through which it manifests itself. And it is able to deploy its own force only in proportion as it can make that energy available for its own use and subservient to its own purposes. Now, here is a very great insight with many implications. The most obvious first, which he is speaking of, is the life force being also driving the mind. Mind is dependent on it. If there is insufficiency of life force in the mind, mind cannot function to its optimum. If there is insufficiency of life force linking mind with the body, mind is unable to act in and through the body in the world. Now let's look at two obvious implications. Suppose the life energy linking mind and body is weakened sufficiently. Let's say by exaggerated fasting, by insufficient food and nourishment, by lack of sleep, the life energy in the physical consciousness loses its hold, its grip, and begins to disengage. The result is the mental consciousness is no more grounded in the physical and begins as if to float off. The body may be extremely tired, but the mind may be extremely fresh. And in this state, a person may say, "Oh, I'm feeling fine. I don't need to eat. I don't need to sleep. I'm perfect as I am. In fact, I feel more energetic. My mind is clearer." Because the mind is as if released from the limitations of the gross body's inertia. But the danger is this: it loses hold through the gross body on the physical world. It then begins to engage much more in this freed state directly with the vital or mental worlds. And at that point, one begins to sense and see things which belong to that domain, but is unable to distinguish with things of the physical world. And so you start seeing objects, you start seeing beings, forces, you begin to sense things which may even be projections of your own mind, constructions of your own mind, but now appearing to you as objective, because such is the nature of the mental world. In the mental world, you can conceive in great detail of an enormous picture, idea, experience, and form it around you like the reality, so vivid, so detailed, so real, that you forget you are dreaming or that you are in the mental world. It is concretely, really the reality. But it's entirely a projection of your mind. And one begins then to lose, because one treats the mental world as one would the physical, one begins to lose the objectivity and begins to wander off into constructions or fears of your own unpurified mind. And people then would be labeled insane or hallucinating and so on. But the reality is, the hallucination is a truth. It is a reality, but of a different plane. It is a subjective reality and not a real objective in that sense. But still it is a real experience. This often happens when a person is very sick and connection is loosened. The same thing could be loosened by introduction of certain chemicals in the body, as is done with psychedelic drugs. And the result is a brief exposure to the vital and mental worlds, generally of a very low order. But we can understand now how and why this happens, and why the mind is helpless when this link of the vital energy with the gross body weakens. The second obvious implication is this, that mind needing life force in order to be fully activated to its full potential, mind is competing with the gross body for life energy. Where the life energy is turned and imprinted or infused more in the gross body, the mental abilities tend to weaken. Equally, when the life energy is directed towards the mind and refined in an upward concentration, the body tends to become depleted, weakened, or feels tired, or may even fall into illness if it is not sufficiently supported. And so it is a struggle in human evolution to prioritize between these. Normally, evolution drives first the gross body's development, builds its strength, but the moment nature turns towards the mind's development, the body begins to weaken. And we see this in the transition from the ape to the human, where the strength of the ape is lost in the very redirection of the life energy into the mind. But much more so in people who live in the mental consciousness. You will rarely find a professor of philosophy or mathematics who has a strong body, who is a bodybuilder. It's rare. We have such people also. But mostly, when a person has a very strong physical life, the mental life weakens. Or when they have a refined, developed mental life, the physical life tends to weaken. If you want to develop both and master both and bridge both fully, you need a huge amount of life energy. And only those who have that can accomplish it. By yoga, such a thing becomes possible. But we understand now there is always a competition between the demands of the mental being's development and the gross body's development. In the further implications of this, when he says that the mind needs the life energy, the full resolution, the full release of the mind's capacities can be made when sufficient energy of a refined grade is directed to the mind. Now here we come to a very important distinction. Although life force is same, when it thus infuses itself in the gross body, it has a dense character. And from there, if you raise it into the mind, it tends to dull the mind. Similarly, if the life energy is refined and purified in the mental consciousness, and from there directed to the gross body, it tends to refine the gross body. But there is such a thing, a distinction of a denser life energy movement and a refined life energy movement. And thus, the two gradations of the life plane, which Sri Aurobindo calls higher vital and lower vital. The lower vital being much more dense and instinctive in its impulsions, whereas the higher vital being refined in mind, much more self-aware and much more able to master and be also freer and wider. But these two grades also and their mix creates often many turbidities in the sadhaka until the refinement and purification is complete. Now all of these implications are there, but most of all, the amplification of the mind's powers to go beyond their limitation, and especially beyond the limitation imposed by the gross body, where mind can see beyond the physical senses, act beyond the physical body. Most of the so-called psychic powers are nothing but the direct action of the mind through life force bypassing the gross body. All of these are possible when enough energy is directed to them. I am reminded of some extraordinary experiments and measurements in the laboratory of people with psychic powers. Remember, there was one example I had read of Russian psychic Nelia Mikhailova, who used to move objects by concentrating on them in the laboratory conditions. And it was observed when she did that, there was a huge release of energy around her. Even sometimes people felt the release of heat, but she herself would be exhausted by that effort. And often in a single half-hour session in the laboratory, she would lose 2 or 3 kilos of body weight, just by the amount of energy which is exerted. Of course, this is extremely inefficient. Others are able to do the same thing with far greater efficacy. But it just shows that because the life force was not really freed, it was dragging out so much from the gross body. Similarly, often mediums who become channels for apparitions and materializations, they tend to lose a lot of their weight. They're often sickly and weak in the physical body because the life force is drawn out to create all these magical results. On the other hand, we have also the record in laboratory conditions of another psychic, much more free and natural, by the name of Ingo Swann, who, when he would concentrate to have a physical result of increasing temperature, less dramatic than moving objects, but increasing temperature or some other kind of magnetic influence, they would register around the body voltages in the air shooting up to 400 volts. Now, the physical body has a slight electric character in the aura, very slight, barely measurable, going into millivolts perhaps, with very little current. You try to put a bulb, immediately the voltage drops because it's very low current, high impedance. But it can be measured. In the normal air above the earth, they say 1 meter of height has an electric potential difference of 100 volts, about. So around the human being, in the aura, one can measure in high impedance these voltages, very low current. But when he would concentrate for some psychic result, the voltage would shoot up 300-400 volts more, and there would be wild fluctuations of the voltage. Just to show that these things have a physical impact, and they involve a direction of a huge amount of pranic energy on a material as well as mental level. So of this now Sri Aurobindo elaborates, and the most important implication is this. In proportion, therefore, remember the mind's power is in proportion as it can draw this life force to itself. In proportion, therefore, as the yogin gets back to the control of the prana, and by the direction of its batteries opens up those nervous centers, chakras, in which it is now sluggish or only partially operative, he is able to manifest powers of mind, sense, and consciousness which transcend our ordinary experience. So, the key here is getting back to the control of the prana with the mind's awareness, redirect the batteries of prana In other words, there are within us those condensed, concentrated sources of life force. Redirect those batteries of prana to open up the nervous centers, the chakras, where the life energy is sluggish or partially operative. Then they become active, and to that extent the powers of the mind are freed, and one is able to manifest extraordinary powers of mind, sense and consciousness, including most of what is categorized as psychic powers. The so-called occult powers of yoga are such faculties which thus open up of themselves as the yogin advances in the control of the pranic force, and purifying the channels of its movement establishes an increasing communication between the consciousness of his subtle, subliminal being and the conscious physical and superficial existence. So by this process of purifying the channels, the nadis, the subtle channels, by the opening and freeing up of the chakras, the life energy is able to pass the communication from the subtle body and the subliminal being to the gross body, and so all of these possibilities proper to the inner, subtle and subliminal consciousness are now accessible in the external consciousness. Very simply stated, but of great importance. In the integral yoga though, this method is not used. We do not try first to get to the control of the prana and then to open the chakras. Rather, the whole movement is one of purification of the whole being, all the layers, beginning with what is most accessible from above downwards. And as the purification works by the action of the Shakti in us, the purification of the nadis takes place first. The chakras gradually beginning to be freed and opened up and activated. There is a gradual transition by the action of the Shakti, not by our direct concentration. The effective result is there, but we do not begin by trying to catch the life energy and master it first, as is done by the Hatha Yogin. Even the Raja Yogin starts with the mind. So this is the point Sri Aurobindo makes. Thus, the prana is vital or nervous force which bears the operations of mind and body and is yoked by them as it were a horse to a chariot and driven by the mind along the paths which it wishes to travel to the goal of its desires. Therefore, it is described in this Upanishad as yoked and moving forward, and again as led forward. So all of this will take up next time, and the yoking and the images used, we will review them. But for now, all that we have read of the operations of the prana, I would like to refer to another text of Sri Aurobindo, transcribed by him, published by him, but not written by him. He does not claim authorship of it. It is an unusual text in that sense. In fact, it was during a period when Sri Aurobindo was experimenting with various things of the subtle domain. He saw his brother experiment with automatic writing, and so he saw for himself what was the principle of it and its relevance. He described as automatic writing that which is written without the conscious mind's intervention. So he would hold the pen, and the hand would move and write. So it was not written by him. But his conclusion after these experiments was this, and I read from the text he wrote in his letter, that automatic writing, that there are sometimes phenomena which point to the intervention of beings of another plane, not always or often of a high order, the mass of such writings comes from a dramatizing element in the subconscious mind. Sometimes a brilliant vein in the subliminal is struck, and then predictions of the future and statements of things known in the present and past come up. But otherwise, these writings have not a great value. So this was his conclusion, and this text was thus written in the form of an automatic writing, 1 chapter a day in the evening as a form of amusement, And what is interesting is when we read the text, it is called Yogic Sadhan. When we read the text, it is completely in alignment with Sri Aurobindo's own teaching and writing, but of a very preliminary level of knowledge. So Sri Aurobindo did publish it after having thus written it. He did not put his name, it was simply written by him as edited by Uttar Yogi, the yogi from the north, as he was known then to some of the disciples in Tamil Nadu. And subsequently 3 or 4 editions came, and after 1930, I believe, he stopped its publication. But in a letter, he discusses how the text of this have only a preliminary value, and one can follow its. He himself wrote an epilogue, an editor's epilogue at the end, where he says that you can of course follow this if you find it helpful, but it has only a preliminary value for the yoga. So having understood that, we now look at the text. There are 2 chapters, 7 and 8, which deal with prana. The first one deals with the distinction between the gross prana and the subtle prana, discusses the action of prana in the body, and the other chapter discusses the action of the prana in the mind. So I will just read some selections, and because there are a lot of Sanskrit words, I will translate freely as I read them so that we do not get stuck with vocabulary. I come next to prana, the nervous or vital element in man, which is centralized below the manas and chitta, sense mind and conscious stuff of mind, in the subtle body, and connected with the navel in the gross body. Here I must distinguish between the subtle prana and the gross prana. The former moving in the nervous system of the subtle body as described in the yogic books, the latter in the nervous system of the gross. The two are closely connected and almost always act upon each other. Now there's a lot of fine details here, which is why I wanted to read this text. So there is the subtle body and its channels, which we call the nadis, gross body and its nervous system, the two being connected primarily through the chakras but also through other crossing points, and there's a constant exchange between the two. Now often it is popularly described as the chakras being the only links between the subtle and the gross. They are rather the main links. There are also many minor, even fine fibrous connections between the subtle body and the gross. And when the subtle body is forced to separate from the gross, many of these finer fibers also snap as they disengage. So he says, the two are closely connected and almost always act upon each other. The prana forms the link between the physical and the mental man. I must here warn you against stumbling into the error of those who try to harmonize yogic science with the physical science of the Europeans and search for the yogic nadis and chakras in the physical body. So this was in fact a problem, many of the European scientists trying to understand the pictures that they saw of the yogic descriptions of the subtle body. They said, well, you cut the physical body, you don't find it, so obviously this is wrong. They didn't realize that this belonged to a different level of the subtle body. There are, he says, you will not find them there in the gross body. There are certain centers in the physical nervous system with which the chakras correspond. Otherwise, Hatha Yoga would be impossible. But the chakras are not these centers. The Europeans are masters in their own province of knowledge, and there you need not hesitate to learn from them. But for God's sake, do not subject your higher knowledge to their lower. You will only create a most horrible confusion. Develop your higher knowledge first, then study their sciences, and the latter will at once fall into their place. Now, this is the approach we would take from the yogic perspective. Then he says, it is with the subtle prana that I am principally concerned, for the gross prana belongs to the physical rather than the inner. And I will speak of it in connection with the physical. And then he discusses how the life force in the body is, or the life force generally, he says, is the seat of desire, and its purification is of utmost importance for the yogin. You have to first get rid of desire, otherwise nothing can be accomplished in permanence. And it's a very interesting discussion, and he gives the example. If you try to use your will to still the mind and purify the emotions, you cannot get rid of desire utterly. You can drive it out by self-control or by a coercion, but it will come back. He warns of all this. I'm not reading, I'm just summarizing here. And then he gives an example. That is to say, it has a temporary result, and the coerced desires come back ravening and more furious than before. That was what Christ meant by the parable of the devil. It's a very interesting passage in the biblical tradition, and I read it because for those of you who are familiar with that, the understanding of it will help. That was what Christ meant by the parable of the devil, the unclean spirit who is driven out of a man only to return with 7 spirits worse than himself. For it is in the nature of things, the unalterable nature of things, that unpurified emotion must clamor after desire, and unstilled manas give it harborage wherever it returns, and unilluminated buddhi contains the seed of it ready to sprout up at the first opportunity. So he says, therefore you have to purify from the desire, and so on. And then another interesting thing he says, remember moreover that all desires have to be got rid of. Those which are called good as well as those which are called bad. Very interesting insight. Although very preliminary for Sri Aurobindo. They are not relevant at the higher stages, but very interesting insight, he says. Some people will tell you, keep the good desires and drive out the bad. Do not listen to that specious piece of ignorance. You can use the good desires to drive out the bad on condition that immediately after you drive out the good also by the one desire of liberation and union with God. You see the process. Ideally one drives out all desire. But if at all you have to accept good desire, you use it momentarily to drive out the bad, but then get rid of the good. Why? A very interesting insight here. We'll come to that. So the one desire by which you drive out the good is the desire for union with God and the liberation. But even that last desire, finally, you must renounce and give yourself up wholly to God's will. And even in that last and greatest matter, becoming utterly desireless. That last step also, you have to let go of the desire for liberation and union. Otherwise, you will find yourself traveling in a vicious circle. For if you keep desire at all, he is such a born traitor that he will eventually open the door to your enemies. When the unclean spirit returned to his house, he found it swept and garnished. That is, purified of bad thoughts and adorned with good desires. And immediately he got in and made the last state of that man worse than his first. So, get rid of all desires utterly, good, bad, and indifferent. Get beyond virtue as well as beyond vice. Be satisfied with no bondage, even though the fetters be of pure gold. Admit no guide or master but God, even though they be gods or angels who claim your homage. So it's a very interesting idea. You see, even if you keep a good desire, it is still desire. And as long as the imprint of desire is there, the same force, the same process in the same part will permit the bad desire. But now the grooves of good desire are accepted, so that it will flow straight in and compel you. So this is... We skip that, equality he speaks of, etc. And then he says, the next chapter, there remains the the gross part of man, which is composed of the gross prana or physical nervous system and the annam or body in which the prana operates. The prana is the principle of life. Death is brought about by the dissolution of the tie between the subtle body and the gross body. That tie is the prana. The subtle body takes the prana into itself and departs. The little that is left in the gross body is of the nature of apana, with a tendency to that species of dissolution which we call corruption. Remember the 5 functions of life energy in the body: prana, apana, samana, udana and vyana. So prana was the taking in of life force, apana was the throwing out, but particularly its function is breaking down, dissolution. So the life force linking the subtle body with the gross. At the time of death, the subtle body withdraws the life force into the subtle. A little may remain in the gross body, principally of the nature of the apana, and that's what immediately begins the breakdown. It's very interesting to notice how, from the time of physical death, the breakdown of the body is so rapid. Sometimes within minutes one begins to see signs. Within an hour or two already the breakdown starts. And yet there are situations where a person is in trance and practically all the breathing and the heartbeat has slowed down to the point where it's barely perceptible, 1 beat a minute, and there is no degeneration and decay in the body for hours. How do you explain that? And it is explained because it is not a physical process, it is the life force being withdrawn which is the key. And when the prana is withdrawn, the apana is active, it begins the disintegration rapidly. So, the prana part of it, which can alone hold the body together, evaporates. And the apana leads to swift disintegration. In some animals, however, the prana is so abundant that the body shows sign of life even after the subtle body has departed. It's very interesting. We have seen this in certain cases of certain masters of Hatha Yoga or even other systems, because they worked on the body consciousness and the infusion of the life energy in the body, that even after physical death, the body is disintegrating. In Sri Aurobindo's case, it was not an action of the prana, but the action of the supramental force which he had brought down in the gross body, and therefore the body did not decay for several days, as long as the light was there. But it's a different process. One does not compare it with this other case. It is the energy. There was one example, I was told, we saw it in the news, of a monk in, I believe, Indonesia, still there, his body is there for the last 200 years. After he died, the body remained in Padmasana, but the body remained not only not degenerating, but it remained plastic. So there are even now people who go and shake hands and the body is still elastic. There's no degeneration or breakdown. The tissue has just dried up, shriveled, but is still elastic. There are other cases where people have been found in a state of deep meditation, and sometimes even it appears the person is still in that trance, cataleptic trance, and the body has not degenerated for centuries. In some cases they would put a physical samadhi around such beings, and to this day the body is said to remain thus. I had seen a news item about 2 years ago. I think it was in Mongolia. They found one such, where the body had been encapsulated in a metal sheath, I think. And opening it, they found the body completely intact without degeneration, but it seemed to be alive, although there was no functioning. And that's typically a sign that it is somebody who had gone into cataleptic trance and not death. In India, we have another example. There are many examples of saints like this. One of them is the example in Maharashtra of Sant Jnaneshwar, who took living samadhi, asked for the samadhi to be built around him as he entered into trance, at the age of 19 having completed his work, but subsequently, some years later, he appeared in dream to one of his chief disciples and said, "Can you please help me? There is a tree root which has grown through the soil and is poking my body and is disturbing my state of trance." So, under supervision of the disciples, they opened the samadhi, they went in, his body was still intact in Padmasana, and there was a tree root which had poked, so they cut that and again closed the samadhi. So there are examples like this which are validated in history, where one can retain the consciousness in the body even though effectively one is in a trance and there's no breathing or heartbeat. The means for this is described in this text shortly. But right now he's discussing how the life force bridges the two and how it withdraws at the time of death. Also we can see in certain parts of the body where the life energy is very strongly held, often the body processes continue although the gross overall life force has been withdrawn. So after death, sometimes they see cells are still continuing to function in certain parts of the body and sometimes for several hours after. And all of these exemplify what he's saying here. When the prana is abundant, the body shows signs of life even after the subtle body has departed. Then he says, I have been dealing throughout with the purification of the subtle part of man. The subjection of the body is a little foreign to my purpose. Nevertheless, a few words are necessary. The principle upon which this yoga I am explaining to you stands is that the gross body is merely the shadow or creation of the subtle body. Body is a mold into which mind pours itself. But the mold itself has been prepared by the mind and can be changed by the mind. Now this is very important, and I am reading these passages for these gems. The gross body is formed in the mold of the mental body. The mind pouring itself forms the gross body and therefore can be changed by mind. This is such a deep truth. We have been programmed from childhood to think the reverse. By accepting the reverse of this, we subject ourselves to the falsehood. If we shift and return to the truth of it, which is mind leads body, then so much is possible with the body. I'll read the text further and then we will elaborate on this idea. A mind purified, liberated and perfected can do whatever it likes with the body. It may leave it as it is, allowing the past karma to do its will with the physical part in the form of disease, suffering, misfortune and death, without the mind being in the least affected. All that is impurity and bondage, which is the physical translation and result of mental impurity and bondage. So you see, the physical body's illness is a reflection of the impurity and bondage in the mental consciousness. With the cessation of the cause, the effect ceases, but not at once. It is like the steam in the locomotive. So he discusses how that works. We skip that. But on the other hand, you may pursue them into the body when you drive out limitations and drive them out from there as well. In that case, you get the kaya shuddhi and the kaya siddhi. Kaya being here the body, shuddhi is purification, siddhi is perfection. So now I'll translate it. Body is purification and body is perfection. They are usually sought after by the Hatha Yogic or Raja Yogic processes, but these are not necessary. It is even better and certainly much easier and surer to follow the process I have been indicating. And what is the broad line of that? The very fact of having a purified mind makes for purity of the body. A liberated mind for liberation of the body. A perfected mind for perfection of the body. And to a certain extent, as you go on with the yoga, in the inner layers, the body will automatically begin to respond to the new influences. But you should not consciously meddle with the body until you're finished with the mind. Let nature do its work, detach yourself as much as possible from the body, think of it as a mere cause. Leave it to the care of God and His Shakti. He discusses how illnesses can come, etc., impurities in the body. Then he discusses what happens when now the body's purification and perfection is activated. He says, impurities in the body show themselves chiefly as disease, as pain, as the discomfort of heat and cold, as the necessity of the excretive processes. 4 symptoms of the body's limitation. The first sign of body purification, Kaya Shuddhi, is the disappearance of all tendency of disease. The second sign is liberation from the duality of heat and cold, which will either go altogether or change to pleasurable sensations, often marked by electrical phenomena. All of this Sri Aurobindo went through. And the third, the diminution or disappearance of excretive activity. This is a very interesting idea which you see in the Hatha Yogic tradition. The sign that the life force has gripped the body and is now dominating, the mind and life energy are dominating the gross body. One of the signs is the reduction of the quantum of matter excreted. In other words, you may eat the same quantity of food, but the body is able to assimilate and absorb all the nutrition, and what is thrown out is very little. And then finally, the fourth symptom, pain also can be entirely eliminated from the body. But even before the reaction called pain is got rid of, or even without its being got rid of, the discomfort of pain can be removed and replaced by a sort of bodily ananda. Finally, the craving of hunger and thirst disappears from the prana to which it belongs, and the dependence on food diminishes or ceases. You see, the craving of hunger and thirst is principally a craving of the prana, not even of the gross body. That's why you will see when there is the craving of hunger and thirst, the body may be relaxed, but the impulse to reach out is an energetic impulse. And if it is delayed long enough, you get upset, you get angry, you lose self-control, because it is the prana which is agitated, not the gross body or the mind. It drags the mind and the gross body in its agitation. The perfection of all this is the basis of Kaya Siddhi, body perfection. The perfect body perfection includes other developments such as the siddhis of Mahima, Laghima, Anima, and the invulnerability and incorruptibility of the body. Now these are all things which will happen when the life force in the body is fully purified and masters the body operations. And their Mahima is the huge increase of energy, strength, and even to some extent the form becoming larger or heavier. And so popularly it is described as the body being made big, but that's only a secondary aspect. It is more this increase of the body capacity. Laghima is the opposite, making the body light and free of strain. But Anima is something even more extraordinary. It is as if the dissociation of the physical atoms of the body to such a degree that the body loses the sense of tiredness, loses the compulsion to some extent even of gravity, and can be made as if semi-transparent or as if invisible even, dematerialized partially or wholly at will. And with that invulnerability and incorruptibility, even a sharp object hitting will not cut or damage. And all of these are siddhis which have been demonstrated in yogis. Sri Aurobindo himself discusses many of these as they develop in his own practice, in his personal diary notes in the record of yoga. But the text continues, powers hitherto attained in the Kali Yuga only by very advanced siddhas. Now what do they depend on? What is the secret of these powers? He reveals. They depend primarily on the replacement of the ordinary fivefold process of prana, apana, vyana, samana and udana, by the single simplified action of the original or elemental force of prana, the infinite vital energy surcharged with electricity, Vaidyutam. Now this is the text, literally what we have been reading here when Sri Aurobindo speaks of the action of the pure prana bypassing the fivefold operations. When you get the mastery of the pure operations of the prana, no more dependent on this fivefold process, it can act directly in a single simplified action of the original or elemental force of prana. With that comes, because now the prana is liberated, infinite vital energy surcharged with electricity, and it has an electrical character. Now you realize why many of those occult psychic experiences were accompanied by electricity and voltage measured around those people. It's one of the side effects of this particular kind of action. But the simplified action of the original prana allows its direct action on the entire body substance by passing its channelized action through the nadis and the nervous system, which is limiting it. And so all of these capacities of the body and the siddhis are spontaneously and easily possible. So he says all of these important elements of the yoga, they can be developed if the mental siddhi is perfected. And it is on this perfection that I wish you to concentrate your energy and attention. When you get that, you get everything. And so on, the text. And then he says, the last part of this chapter, the Europeans are obsessed with the idea of the physical as the master of the mental. I would have you hold fast to the opposite standpoint and always remember that for the body to impose its conditions on the mind is an abnormal state of man's being, which has to be got rid of. It is the mind that must command, condition, and modify the body. So we now drop the text. I selected this portion which is only relevant for the passage we are reading relating to life energy and its operations. And when Sri Aurobindo says that in proportion as the yogin gets back to the control of the prana, he is able to manifest powers of the mind, sense and consciousness which transcend our ordinary experience. You got a glimpse of that in this text, including the means and the science of it. So we now set aside this text and come back to what we have been reading. Thus, the prana is vital or nervous force which bears the operations of mind and body, is yoked by them, as it were, like a horse to a chariot, and driven by the mind along the paths on which it wishes to travel to the goal of its desires. This idea we can dwell on. This idea, as we dwell upon, we can become conscious of it in ourselves. Use this as a theme of meditation to realign and rearrange the relationship of these three in us. Where earlier we were body, we had mind, and we felt energy animating both. Now we are going to reverse the poise. We are first and foremost, in our experience, mind. Yes, self, psychic, all that is fine, but it's not in our experience at the moment. We are first and foremost mental being, which has a body and which uses the life energy to animate the body and animate itself and drive around. So the experience is of the mind seated in the chariot, which is the body, life energy as the horses which are yoked. They first are yoked to the gross body, the chariot. That's where you feel it first. But then there are subtler yokes the reins actually, by which the mind holds the horses. While the physical yoke is a mechanical attachment by which it pulls the gross body, the subtle yokes of the mind, that is the reins, are plastic. Through them, the mind pushes the horse, nudges the horse, indicates go left, go right, pulls back, slow down, or releases and says go ahead, full speed ahead. And this is the mind's control of our life energy. Suddenly we find ourselves getting angry, we restrain, we pull the reins. No, cool down, reduce this energy, relax. Or suddenly now, there is a requirement to do a lot of work. Oh my God, we have to finish this in the next 1 hour. We infuse, we release, we activate the energy and move forward with full force. So the mind has to learn the skill of being able to rein in or release life force, and with it, the skill of directing life force. Turn left, turn right, forward, gentle trot, gallop, but in perfect control. You cannot allow the horse to lead you and drive you. If suddenly the horse is upset, someone fires a gunshot, the horse jumps up in fear, it starts running in panic, the mind is saying cool down, but is unable to restrain. And that's not acceptable. So we have to train the mind and its control on the life force. One of the most effective means for this is to be in an activity which involves use of intense life energy, but in a regulated form. Where do we do that? In sports, running, and especially in games. Especially in games where you have to activate and slow down, and activate and slow down. Follow with precision, fine corrections constantly. One of the most effective is basketball. Even in football, you have to run long distances. There are not fine course corrections. Basketball takes place in a very small space. You have to instantly be able to adapt to a changing situation. And the mind has to be able to release energy, withhold, direct, and the full skill of the horse and the control of the horse is developed there. The body also has to be brought into this ambit. The body to be made plastic, capable, responsive, both to mind and to life energy. And in this way, we realign the current balance of mind, life force, and body. And with the mind in charge, are able then to direct the body's activities and the life energy as we will, freely, without opposition or resistance. All of this is fine as long as the balance is held with a small quantum of life force. The moment you increase the life energy, suddenly it becomes too much. It's easy to ride a baby horse. When you want to ride an adult horse which has twice your energy, you lose control very quickly, unless you can be greater than it. So there comes the second aspect of the training, which is being able to increase life energy gradually, and yet retain that balance and that skill and mastery now with greater and greater energy, as if relearning at each step. All of this would be a part of the yoga when taken in this spirit. Of course, one can simply neglect it and choose to take it up later, but then the body may not be so supportive. And finally, I want to close with an insight which will make sense when we dwell upon it in this way. What is the experience of the life energy, the life body, the pranamaya kosha, the sheath of life energy by itself, not identified with gross body or with mind? When we come to that, and it is not difficult to access this if you work a little bit on this, you will find standing like this, disengaged from the gross body and its sensations, disengaged from the mind and its sensations, and be aware only of life energy, and you will experience yourself as this column of energy. If then you have to map it, you will feel it's primarily mapped around torso and the spine. Now in this column of life energy, there is a lower and a higher and gradations in between. You're conscious of that. But this column of life energy reaches out to act upon the world, and the branch of energy that reaches out is what flows from the torso as the arms. you could have a single energy reaching out. But generally, when you have to exercise action on an object, you want two forces of energy to pull apart or to compress. You cannot do with a single energy. There has to be two, even if two fingers. And so there's this double movement of the energy coming out from the central column. And part of the energy which is cognizing and entering in relation with the world is the higher part, which is more conscious. The part which is rooting itself in the gross world is the lower part. And so we experience our senses seated at the top, our cognitive abilities seated here, and from there, therefore, taking in the experience of the world, not only through the senses, but even in the form of nourishment. Therefore, in the gross body, the mouth is here, the eyes and all the primary senses are up here at the top. The stomach is below, but the mouth is up for a good reason, because it's from here that we take in. And it is below that we throw out. And so the whole movement of the gross physical organization of the organs of the physical body is entirely a reflection and image of this awareness of life energy and the way it acts free of mind and body if it has to act as an individual of energy, pure energy. Now, pure energy does not have form. And yet it has this sense of relationship between its activities. That relationship is mapped out in the form and structure of the gross body. One can go deeper into the operations of the organs, and then we'll understand why the organs are placed in such a way. They could have been placed differently. And you will notice how they correspond similarly to processes of the life force. That is why the prana is the upper half, the apana is the lower half, etc. There's a whole structure to the organization which is formless to begin with, but when brought into form, takes on broadly this frame. And this also is the reason why you will find anywhere in the world, anywhere in the universe, wherever there is organized living form, it broadly follows this structure. The legs simply extensions for moving around, duality again there in order to maintain balance, but with variations, all creatures, all beings, anywhere in the universe will be broadly structured in this manner. The mental body then, as it forms around this bundle of life energy, mind awareness takes on the similar structure, gross body tissue takes on similar structure, and the two are bridged by the life force in between. And when you experience it in this way in yourself, all these three layers connected, it can be the first step towards mastering and rearranging their mutual relationships. So it's something you can dwell upon and meditate and experiment on your own, and you will find how useful it can be. So we'll continue with this text next Sunday. A lot of very interesting insights, a lot of suggestions, very practical implications scattered in these texts, put in a structure, but in the portion we are reading, hinted at, but in the other text which we saw, elaborated at. And so it is something worth working upon. And Sri Aurobindo, having taken trouble to map out all these things, he wants us to know that all of these processes which are currently managed by life energy in us can be and will be directly managed by the life of our life when that enters. So in the divinized life, all these operations will still be present, but not dependent on the physical life energy or the mental life force, but on the spiritual energy which will enter us and take charge of the operations of life force by a higher power and a freer power of consciousness. And that will be the beginning of the spiritualization of the mind and the body. So all of this is useful to understand the larger picture and the means of the divinization. We can meditate on this for a while.